Hi ladies, and welcome to our poinsettia tutorial. I am going to be just kind of testing out some of my colors here. Oh, the light is bright. So testing out some of my colors here for this painting. So as you can see, this particular reference photo, it has a lot of red in it, and you could also use like magentas and some pinks. Just a little bit of greens in here and some yellows. So basically the colors I'm going to be using, I have 3 different reds on my palette. I have a yellow, I have a green, a sap green, ultramarine blue, and an indigo blue. I'm not sure if I'm going to be using all of these colors, but I did put them out just in case. So the reds that I had, it's called crimson red. It's kind of bright, like a scarlet lake. You could also use this other red I have. It's called and I'm using all different brands here. This one is called a Crimson Lake. So this is a Holbein brand. And this is called Crimson Lake. This is called Crimson Red, Crimson Lake. And then this third red I have, another brand, Mission Gold, is called Permanent Red. So, you don't have to have these same exact colors because I have so many different brands of paints. And so I would say if you just had an alizarin crimson red and a scarlet lake, you'll be fine. Because these two remind me of scarlet lake. They're pretty bright red, like a bright red. And if you wanted to also use like a magenta, you could throw a magenta in there, or a permanent rose, a pink in there would be nice to use as well to mix. So don't be afraid, like if you don't have the exact color of the exact petal here, we just are going to get the essence of this. I'm not going to be painting, I'm not trying to match the exact shadow color, the exact red in here. I'm not trying to do that. So I'm just brought out a few reds. I brought out a yellow, so a couple blues and a green. I can always mix my yellow and my blues to make a green. I can mix a red and a blue to make a violet for some darker shadowy areas. So you can pick and choose the colors you want. I basically have the 3 primaries with a green added. Red, blue, yellow. They're your primary colors. So you can make a lot of colors with just those 3 primary colors. So what I'm doing now, I just have a small round brush, and I'm going to just test these colors on my paper to see kind of what they look like when I paint them. So that's more like a light switch situation here is not working. Hang on. I'm going to get a lot of shadow this way. That is a nice bright kind of red. Very, very close to what those petals are. And this is that. That looks more pinky as well. That is called a Crimson Lake. Nice dark red. Kind of like alizarin crimson. Maybe just a little bit more winey color. It's pretty. And then this one is called Permanent Red, which is to me like a Scarlet Lake color. So those are like 3 different kind of reds. Actually, these are more on the pink. These look more pinky to me than this guy. And then I just have a sour lemon yellow. You could use lemon yellow. You could use any kind of bright yellow that you have, if because I'm going to end up toning that down anyway. That's a bright yellow. Then, of course, I have my favorite sap green. If you don't have sap green, you can make a green using your yellow, any yellows and blues. Make different greens. So there's my sap green. Of course, my ultramarine blue, my most commonly used blue, ultramarine blue, a little water on there. And then we have the indigo, which I love, 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 my favorite. Indigo, I use so much for all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of a greenish base, blue color. And that's my indigo. So those are the colors I'm going to be using for this tutorial. So I have my 5x7 sheet of watercolor paper and my reference photo. Now, these yellow stamens are the lightest, and then this part of the leaf here is the lightest thing really in our painting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in my yellows first, and then I'm going to let them dry, and then I'm going to end up painting around them with my reds. Because, or what you could do, if you don't feel comfortable painting around them, because you're going to have to get in between here with a small brush with some of your red color. So if you're not comfortable with that, you can always take masking fluid. And if you're not familiar with masking fluid, there's all different kinds. It's basically like a rubber cement that you would use an old paintbrush. An old paintbrush, guys. Don't use a good paintbrush for this because it will ruin your brush. So what you basically want to do is there's kind you can use a brush. You can also, they make them in pen form, like this is another one I have. It's also called Misket. And they're kind of different colors, so then you can see them on the paper. So basically what I do, I'm not going to do it, but I'll just show you. You take an old brush, you dip, it's liquidy, and you would dip it in here, and then you would, like dip it in there, and then you would paint wherever you wanted. You would use this, paint wherever you wanted to protect your paper from getting any paint on it. So basically this just protects your paper from getting any paint on it. And then what you do is once you've painted and covered your area that you want to protect, you then have to let it dry naturally for about 15-20 minutes or so it takes to dry. And then what you can do is paint right over top of it and not worry about any red or any colors penetrating that area. So if you want to protect those, you could use masking fluid for that. And then what happens is once you're finished your painting and you're ready to go in and paint these little stamens, you then can use your finger to then erase. It's just like rubber cement. It comes right off. It balls up. You can remove that masking fluid using your finger, or they have, let me see if I have it here. I don't think I have it here. It's a piece of, it's like a square. Oh, wait a minute. Is this it? Yes, I do have it. It's a square, like rubber, hard rubber that you can get at the craft stores, and I use this to remove my masking fluid, and it balls up and you just peel it right off. But you want to let it dry naturally. Don't blow it dry because it'll be very hard to get off your paper if you blow it dry. Okay, so I'm going to start by doing my stamens first, only because I want to paint around mine. So I'm going to start, and we always start with our lightest colors when we're doing our watercolors. So I'm basically just going to go in with my yellow here, and I might mix a tiny bit of my sap green in with my yellow just to, add like to the stem area a little bit. And before I do that, because they kind of have a little bit of a greenish to the base of them a little bit. I don't like this one's too fat. I'm going to take it down a notch. Make it a little thinner. And don't forget to erase those grid lines if you did your grid lines. A little bit of a thinner there stem. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to try and make, I'm not worried about having every little mark here that's in this area of my stamens. I'm just going to kind of get the gist of what's going on in here. I'm not worried about every single little mark here. I'm really not. I just want to get in some of those yellows and some greens, and then I'll go from there. So I'm going to start by using my, let me get a larger brush. I'm going to start by using my number 4 round brush, and I'm going to wet my little stamens. I'm going to do 2 or 3 at a time with just a little bit of water on my brush. And if I get yellow in the background of them, I'm not worried about it because my background's going to be darker in between these. It's going to be darker. So if there are a little bit of yellow bleeds out, it's okay. I'm not worried about it because we can cover it up with our red. You cannot just go lighter. That's what you can. There are ways to do it, but for the most part, you don't paint light over dark with watercolors. You paint dark. You paint your lights first and work towards your darks. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of my sour lemon here and get a little bit on my palette. As you can see, I just kind of tap the tip of my brush in there, bring some color over, add a little bit of my green here, a little bit more yellow. I want more of like a yellowy green color instead of that bright yellow. Now, if you had a really bright yellow and you didn't want it to be so bright, what you would do is you would add your complement to yellow, which is violet or purple. So what you could do is then, if you didn't have a purple, you could make one using a red and a blue, make a violet, and just, kind of equal parts until you get the preferred amount, the color purple that you like. So I have a violet there. So there's a new color I have to my palette now if I want to use. So what I would do is then, let's say I have this yellow and it's very bright. It's a little too bright for what I want to do. And that's the only yellow I have. I would then take a tiny, tiny bit of my violet, just right on the tip of my brush, and I would add it right to my yellow. A little bit of water, and it just dulls it right down. See the difference there between this bright here? It just dulled it down a little bit. Now, if you add too much, you're going to get mud, so you got to be careful. You're going to get more of a gray. So a little bit more. Kind of just toned it down just a little bit. Anytime you need to tone down a color, use its complement. And there's where you would use your color wheel. Red and green, yellow and violet, orange and blue. Those are complements. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and re-wet this a little bit. I tend to go off on tangents. So I'm going to just wet these 3 here. And use this dull down yellow just to drop in a little bit. Now I have a puddle here. There was like too much water on my brush. So there's a puddle. So I'm going to blot my brush, blot the excess water off, and then I can go in and lift out that puddle. called a thirsty brush. And I'm just going to pull that all the way down. And right now it's very, very light. Moving on over to this one. So I'm basically just kind of filling these in a little bit. And just to get in my color, to get rid of that white paper. I'm not worried about details at this point. Don't worry about your details in the beginning. So I'm going to go through and just wet my little stamens. And then I'm going to add in those yellows. Just to get them in. Wet this. Get that yellow in there. I'm not worried about it being perfect. I'm not worried about having the exact little stamen exactly where it is in my reference photo. I just want to get in some of that color. Like this. I tried to do wet on wet most of the time because I like the way the paint spreads better. I just prefer that instead of putting my paint wet on dry paper, which you have, you know, I do, but I really like to do wet on wet. And I feel like I'm missing a stamen there, so I'm just going to add one in. I'm just going to kind of just paint in a shape there. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of that yellowy green, add a little bit more green to that. And you see how light, I mean, I'm not working dark, thick paint. It's kind of watery on my palette. You don't want to start with really dark, thick paint. You want to work your lights and then work towards your dark. So what I'm doing right here is just adding in right where they kind of connect. All those stamens kind of connect right there. So I'm just adding in some greens there to act like that's kind of where they're all being housed from. So I just added in a little bit of color here, and I'm just going to use a damp brush to kind of feather that out so you really can't tell where it starts or stops. I mean, it's just a very light little bit of green there, a little bit of yellowish green, just to establish the housing from where these stamens start. Now, I know some of these stamens look like they have a little bit of orange in them or red, and I'm not worried about that right at this point. No details right away. I just want to get in my base color. Okay, so I'm going to switch brushes here because I'm going to start with a larger. I think I'm going to move, I'll start with this petal here, which would be this petal here. And to the majority of people, they would look at this and say, yeah, it's red. It's just one color. But I see many values of color in here. I see some darker values here. I see some darker values here, a little bit darker here, you know, and a little bit darker right underneath of this leaf here. So I see that. I see a little bit lighter here. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to paint. I'm going to paint in this leaf wet on wet, this petal wet on wet. I'm not worrying about those stamen or the veins in my leaves at this point. Might not even add them ever. but I will decide that later. So right now I just want to get in some color. Okay, so I'm going to just take my brush. I got it nice and wet. Rinse it off so I don't get some green in there. Seems like I got yellowy green color. Okay, I'm just going to use a nice amount of water just to kind of go inside that petal with water. Use more than one brush load. Don't just use one brush load of water. It will not fill that whole petal. And I'm using my number 8 round. I think I might have forgot to tell you. And just fill in that whole petal with water. Nice even sheen of water. Okay, and then I'm going to start, and I'm going to drop in a little bit of my crimson red, which is this top one here. So I'm going to get a little bit on my palette here. Just got a whole bunch of red on the edge. Rinse off my brush. Take this crimson red, and I'm adding water to it. I'm adding just plain water to it because I want it to be really, really moving on my palette, if you can see that. It's not thick and pasty. I'm not just taking a glob of paint and putting it on my paper. I'm adding water to this so I get a nice lighter value of red, and I'm going to just drop it in, and you can see it just kind of immediately feathers out because my paper is wet and my paint is very wet and my brush is pretty wet. So as you can see, as with it being wet, it feathers out. So I'm going to just tilt my paper to help it run this way. I'll add a little bit more. And I kind of start up at the top here and just help it. And can you see how that's kind of running down? I'll go in the direction of the petal. See, and at this point, I am not worrying about my details. I'm not worrying about getting really, really dark right away. I just want to get in my base color. You see how it's just running? I'm going to rinse my brush, and now I'm just going to tap that excess water off and just use a clean brush, damp brush, to help pull that paint down. Now remember, your watercolors always dry later. So this is going to dry much later. All right, I'm going to skip around to this. Let's see, which one am I going to do here? Okay, I think I'm going to skip over to this guy here, which is basically this one. Now, it's kind of hard to tell in this reference photo. It kind of goes like this. And then this leaf here kind of comes up and is tucked under and finishes here. So I have this one here on top. And then I have this line here. And then this line here is my one leaf. And then over here, I have my this leaf here. And I'm going to actually straighten this line a little bit as not to confuse me. I don't know why I drew it like that, but this is kind of like my vein in that one. Okay, and then this petal here, let's just, I don't know, let me straighten this out. So if your reference photo doesn't I know traceable, I mean, if you want to, you know, kind of curve those in a little bit more just to kind of straighten them out. I think what's confusing me is my pencil lines are so dark. I'm going to lighten them up just a little bit. That's that middle one, this vein. It's kind of confusing me a little because it looks like outlines of, so I'm just going to draw in really lightly that vein. So this leaf here, or this petal is this one, and this area here is this one here. I'm going to skip over this one because I don't want any bleeding going on between that petal and this petal because that one is wet. I'm going to skip over to this guy. Okay, and same thing. I'm going to wet them. Just like I did this one. I'm going to wet it. And same color. I'm going to drop it in. So let me pick up my paper a little bit. Sorry for that autofocus. And I'm going to just drop in really watered down, kind of like iced tea consistency. Think of iced tea and how transparent that can be. Diluted red. And I'm just getting in some color. Taking it right off onto my tape. Okay. I'm going to let that dry. I think I'm going to come up to this leaf or this petal right here. Where am I on my drawing here? Okay, so this up here, let me pull this down. This area is this. This kind of bulby shape is this guy behind here. And it's, I know it's harder to tell because it's kind of, they're all like just red right in here. So it's harder to separate them. But I'm going to make this little bulbs by itself. And then this whole area here is just one whole petal. But this is wet, so I don't really want to connect those yet. So maybe what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move up to here. Or no, I'll do this guy since he's not touching anything right now. And he has a little bit of that light green in there. So here's how I'm going to do that without making mud, because I know my red and green are complementary colors. And if I scrub red and green together on this leaf, it's going to turn brown. I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is very careful. I'm just going to, same thing, wet my petal or wet that leaf, whatever that is back there. With my round brush, I'm just going to wet it. Okay, and then I'm going to take my yellowy green color that I had. I'm going to add a little more to that. It's kind of dried on my palette. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to that. And then I'm going to add a little bit of my sap green. Just a little bit. Mixed into that sour lemon or the lemon yellow, whatever you have. So it's kind of like yellowy green right now. And I'm going to just drop that in towards the bottom portion of this leaf where I've wet my paper, and I'm just dropping that in. So can you see that? I didn't really, I want to do it slow, so hopefully it'll stay focused. I didn't really You know, you don't see really like a hard edge because my paper was wet. My paint was fairly wet. It was kind of loose on my palette. So now what I'm going to do is, while this is still damp, take that loose red color. See how that's loose? Nice and light and loose. And I'm going to come to the top here. Oh, my paper has started to dry. Do you see where that it's just sitting there? It's not feathering out. I don't want that. I want it to be feathered out. So I'm going to re-wet this with a clean brush. I'm going to re-wet this. Okay, I'm going to take that paint. I'm just going to drop it in here, and that's what I want. If you can see how that soft feather marks are coming in on my wet paper. And I'm just going to slightly kiss that green, kiss that yellowy green with the tip, very tip of my brush. I'm not scrubbing it together. You don't want to scrub because we don't want to get browns. Okay, so I'm just going to let that go. So very, very lightly red with a little bit of that yellowy green color. And then once I get around and that dries, I can go back in and have more darker greens and some darker reds. But right now, we just want to get in our base colors. Okay. I'm a little bit damp still. All right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to kind of start on this petal over here, and I'm going to go in between my little stamens. Now these are dry, so I'm good there. And I'm going to switch back to a smaller brush, switch back to my number 4, because I'm going to need a smaller brush to get in between these stamens. And I'm basically just doing one value right now, light values. I'm just using the same red watery mixture, but this time I'm going to do it on dry paper in between these little stamens because I don't want things to bleed if I did wet on wet. So I'm going to go in and carefully just kind of paint around my little stamens here. Now here's what I don't want. If I were to just kind of, since I'm painting on dry paper, if I were to stop this and then kind of move around and go on, this would dry with a hard edge. I don't want that. So what I do is I do a few little strokes at a time, few little painting strokes at a time. I stop, rinse, blot, and go in and just take my damp brush and hit those edges with a damp brush. And I go back and get a little bit more water because I don't want my paper to dry with those hard edges. So I just kind of blend it out with water. Now eventually my petal will probably be all wet, but that's okay. So I'm going to go in now and continue around my little stamens here. And then I'm going to stop and rinse and blot and then soften those edges. Now eventually this is going to be much darker back here, so if you do get some hard edges, it's okay. We'll cover them. But I'm just going to kind of go down here and I'm just kind of outlining. There's little stamens are. I can always go back in and darken things up, add darker stems if I wanted with some dark green. Can make my own dark green if I wanted. But right now I'm just trying to get in some of that red that's behind these stamens. And I'm not even really looking at my reference photo. I'm just getting in those gaps. A little bit of water to blend that out. Now everything here is still very, very light value. Get my paint, let's get a little bit more. Ooh, too dark. Add some water. Always lighten your colors using water. Okay. Avoiding this petal. And just getting it in that red. Okay, so I'm going to just keep working around my little stamens here with that very kind of watered down. Move my palette here so it's easier to see. So I just do little, bits at a time, and then I go back and rinse my brush and just use a little bit of water to then, blend out those edges. Start out very pale, and then I build up to my darker values. So damp brush, blend all this out. And, sometimes when I'm dropping in some of this light wash pigment color here, I have already wet the paper by blending out some of those edges. So sometimes when I'm dropping it in, it's hitting that wet paper and it just automatically will feather out a little bit. But I always go back, rinse and blot, and soften them up. I don't want any really hard edges here. So you have to kind of be quick with it sometimes when you're working wet on dry. So I'm just taking that light wash and just kind of going over that whole petal. That whole, I don't know, are they petals or leaves? Just kind of filling it in. Now, if you do get a little bit of color into your little yellow stamens there, you can always take a tissue and, blot it out when it's wet. So just continuing around. adding this light wash through this whole petal here. Now I know there's a lot of different petals here that are overlapping, and it's hard to distinguish sometimes. You know, I think there's one here that's just by itself that's underneath this guy, and then there's one back here. I don't have mine drawn separately like that, but we can, you know, instead of making this one here like all one big petal, I'll be able to separate them just by adding darker values of paint, which I will show you. So right now I'm just filling this whole thing in with that really light wash, not trying to create any detail here. I just want to get in that color and get rid of that white paper. This might not have been the best choice for reference photos, but I really liked it, even though I think it's a fake plant. I really liked it because of its rich colors. So we can, I'll show you how to then make this into more than just one petal. So as you can see, it's just a very light wash of color that I was able to get in between those stamens and, you know, just kind of go with that. So this petal over here, so I have one here, which it's kind of like this guy. And since I'm doing it on a much smaller, it's going to look smaller than what's here. So, and then I have this petal over here, which I think I'm going to extend it a little bit. So I'm going to, I'm kind of just, I'm going to make this, I'm going to lighten this a little bit. That little line right there, I'm going to lighten it. And I'm going to just kind of make it like this will be like the center vein part of that. And I'm just going to continue this petal shape here. So this will be in the background. This will be, you know, like the background. So this right here, this and this will be my whole petal. And then I'll make this like the center vein. Same with this. This will just be the background. And then this and this will be part of my, this petal right here. I'm going to extend it out a little bit. So as long as you haven't wet anything, wet your pencil lines, you can, you know, adjust your drawing if you need to. Okay, so I have my petal here. This one's on top. This, and this guy, and then this one. So I have 1, 2. Well, I'm going to be making this one into 2, actually. So I'll have a separate one coming over here later on. So I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. You really should have odd, but we're going to go with that. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is this guy right here. And this one, for this one, because he has some green and lighter values right here and some reds, I'm going to do this one wet on wet. And I'm not going to be scrubbing in those colors really, really hard. I'm just going to wet my paper. I'm still using a smaller brush here. I'm using my number 4. And just kind of wetting this petal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop in. I'm going to drop in my greens, lighter greens, and some reds. So I'm just really wetting the inside of this shape, getting a nice even layer of water, no puddles, but just a nice sheen of water. And then I'm going to take a little bit of that red, maybe a little bit more saturated. And I'm going to kind of focus out towards the edges here on my wet paper. Remember, no details yet. Just get that color in. And I'm just dotting it. I'm kind of using just little dotty motions. Just getting in. I'm kind of avoiding my center there. So I'm just taking some of that red. And if it starts to get too pasty on your palette, add a little water. Okay, I'm just dropping in a little bit of color here along my edges. Very light-handed, not pressing down hard. Okay, I'll leave it kind of sparse like that. And now I want a little bit of an orange color. I see a bit of an orange in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this red that I was using. I believe that was my crimson red. And I'm going to make a little puddle of orange. So I'll put a little bit over here. I'll mix that with a little bit of my sour lemon yellow. Whatever yellow you have is fine. And I'm going to make a little bit of an orangey red color. And add a little water to that. So it's you know, a little bit puddly on my palette. It's not thick and pasty. And I'm going to drop a little bit of that in on my wet paper here. A little bit of that orangey color. And let it blend in. Well, my paper's still damp. If your paper started to dry out, you might want to wet it a little bit. But I'm just going to drop in a little bit of that orangey color here and there on my damp paper. Now, if you're using paper that's not 100% cotton, it will tend to dry quicker than if you're using 100% cotton paper. It does stay damp a little bit longer. So I'm just adding a little bit of water just to kind of pull some of that color towards the center a little bit. Remember, no details yet. I'm not trying to get in my details and my dark values yet. So now I'm going to drop in a little bit of some green here. I'm not worried about the veins or the lines or anything. So I have this, a little bit of this green and yellow that I mixed, a little bit of my sap green. Let me move this over so you guys can see. So my sap green, which is here. So I just took a little bit of my sap, a little bit of my yellow, and made this yellowy green color. Adjust, you know, adjust the amounts you use of each accordingly to what you like. And I know this is more, it looks kind of like a bluey green sort of, or darker green. Mine's more of a yellowy, and that's okay for right now. I just want to get a little bit in, and so I'm just gonna, I'm kind of going horizontally on my petal here, and I'm just dotting, literally. I'm just kind of dotting and dragging a little bit of that greenish color, very, very faint. Maybe I'll just take a little bit of sap by itself. A little bit of sap green. And maybe it's so easier to see on camera here. And I dot. I do a lot of dotting. It's called stippling. I do a lot of that in my paintings just to get in bits of color instead of making, like, you know, streaks of color. So there, I'm just going to leave that now to dry. And this is pretty dried. So I think, well, I still want to do this one. So I think I'll work on this one. Get my other two done, and then we'll go in and really start shaping our leaves. So I'm going to move over to a larger brush here, number 8 round. And I know this is wet here, so I'm going to just kind of avoid touching that with my brush right now. I'm just going to add some water. Pulling it right to the edge of my paper here, right to the tape. Trying to avoid this petal on top. A little fuzzy. And then also over here, where that petal continues. Or I'm making it continue. Like it's sitting underneath this big one here. Okay, same thing. Very, very loose wash of my crimson red here. And I'm just going to drop that in. I'm going to avoid this little corner for right now until this is dried a little bit more. So just getting in that wash of color, and I on wet paper, wet on wet. And I know there's green here, so I'm not worried about that. I'm just leaving. This is going to be so light that I'm going to be able to drop that green right over top of it, and it's not going to matter because it's very light, very, very light wash right now. Okay, same thing. I'm going to take that yellowy green mixture, and while my paper is wet here, I'm going to just kind of drop it in, go up along the edge of this other petal here, and just drop in some of that yellowy green mixture. I'm being very careful not to scrub those two colors together. I don't want to create a muddy, greeny, muddy look. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my green now, and I'm just letting it bleed out naturally, and I'm not forcing it, you know, blending it together too much. I'm not forcing it. I'm just letting it do its thing. I might even put a little bit over here, even though it's totally not on our reference. I'm going to add a little bit over here. Make it your own. So I'm going to just let that dry. And then I will go back later and work on this a little bit more and darken things up and all that. So now I'm gonna turn this around, and I'm gonna be working on this petal right here. But I want to kind of turn it around and face it this way. So remember, I made this, I'm going to be making this my vein, and here is my whole petal right here. So I'm going to wet this. Sorry about the noise in the background. Okay, just making this nice and evenly wet. And same thing, light wash of the red. Now, if you're worried about, you know, hitting that petal with your damp brush and making a mess there with, you can, you know, dry it or let it dry naturally and then do this part. So really, you know, that's just getting in that first initial wash. And now we get to go back and really start to define things and, you know, create some more detail and things like that. So I'm going to switch back to my smaller, using my number 4 round. Okay, this has dried. So what I'm going to do is, since I don't want this whole piece to be one petal, I'm going to carve out another petal that's like right here. It's really hard to see it, but it is here. So in order for me to do that, I can do one of two things. You could freehand paint it, but much easier if you take your pencil on dry paper. Don't do this while your paper's wet. And if you want, you can then separate, create another petal just with your pencil, and kind of just draw it in where you want that other petal to be. If you want this to be all one, that's totally up to you. But I'm just going to kind of draw in I draw in a few lines here just to kind of separate this from this. And I know and let me pull that up so you see, if you can see where I just drew in very faintly to separate this from this. So now what I'm going to do is, you can do one of two things. We can make this one a little bit lighter and this one a little bit darker. But in the reference photo, it looks like this top one here is a little bit darker than the one behind it. So that's what I'll do. I'm going to make this one a little bit darker, and this one I'm going to keep lighter. But I'm going to add a little bit of orange to this back one. So I think what I'm going to do is, I'm going to wet this back petal a little bit right up to the edge and around my little stamen there and to the line where I just drew. I'm going to wet that. So I'm going to kind of bring all this water, damp brush. Sometimes depending on the brush I use, they really hold a lot of water and put more down than I need. So you can always just take a thirsty brush and blot the excess off, and then go in and lift it out with your brush if you've got too much water. So I'm just going to kind of wet this area here. And I'm going to drop in a little bit of that orange mixture that I made up. Even a little bit of my permanent, what is this color here? My permanent red. I'm just going to make up some orange. So whatever kind of an orangey reddy, whatever, I kind of just use a combo of whatever I have going on in my palette, and I just make my colors that I want to use. So I'm going to drop in a little bit of that orangey red back here on my wet paper. So I think that might have been a little too orangey. So I add a little bit more red. And then I'm really going to focus on darkening my colors here. Now, if you notice on our reference, all these little pokey things, I'm not worried about that. I don't mind. That you can, we can always do if you wanted with like some white gouache paint, white watercolor paint or something towards the end, and then paint over it with a little bit of yellow or something. I'm not going to worry about putting them in. That's totally optional. You can also mask them out. If you were to use masking fluid on your stamens, you could mask them out. But I'm not really worried about them. So I just have added my orangey color back there, and now I'm just taking a damp brush and kind of pulling it out a little bit further. So I'm just doing very light washes. So you can see nothing's really heavy and dark. Right now I'm just kind of getting in that reddy orange color and just kind of pulling it down. So really this is like we're building up our layers, because watercolors are really done in lots of layers to get some darker, richer values. They're done in layers, lots of layers. So here I just took a little bit of that red, braid of red I had, and while my paper's wet here, I'm going to just drop in a little bit, kind of along those edges, a few little edges, random here and there. Let me pull it down a little bit just to give a little bit of a dimension, and rinse and blot, and then use my damp brush to then spread that color out a little bit. So I'm just kind of pulling that color down. Just to add a little bit of depth to those petals. And now this, this one is starting to separate from this guy. So now I'm going to let that sit for a little bit. And as you can notice, I didn't make that whole thing completely orange. I left this a little bit lighter over here and dropped in a little bit of darker values, over here a little bit. So it's, creating some different dimensions in those petals alone. Now this guy over here, he's got that green, and like we did here, I'm going to leave him be right now because I don't want him bleeding into this one. So I'll skip over and I'll work on this one. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to switch to back to my number 8 because it's a larger petal. I'm going to do a larger brush. So larger the area, the bigger the brush you want to use. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm wetting my petal again. And then just dropping in, I'll use a little bit of my orangey mixture. And I'm going to kind of focus my darkest values down towards the center here, where it's kind of it's kind of being shadowed. So using the point of my brush, just pulling that color in on my wet paper. Pick up a little bit more, maybe a little bit red, more red. Dropping the darker, colors towards the center here. And kind of around where this one is, so it's would kind of be shadowy underneath. Okay, I'm pulling that out. I need to turn this, I'm sorry. I'm left-handed, I can work this way. So I'm just pulling out some of that color towards the end of my petal here. Now I just rinsed and blot, and I'm just using pretty much a damp brush at this point to pull whatever paint I have towards the edge of my paper. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of this, this Crimson Lake color. It's more of a maroony, well, more of a pinkyish color red. And I'm going to get a nice saturation of it, more of like a heavy cream consistency, butter consistency, really, really rich saturation. And while this is wet, I'm going to then drop in some really dark saturated color here towards the center of where this petal would be really, you know, it's down in there deep, so it's going to be nice and dark in there. So I'm really, while my paper's wet, as you can see, I'm not getting these harder edges because my paper's wet. I'm just dropping in a little bit of that darker color, and I'm going to rinse and blot, and then just take my damp brush and lightly just pull some of that out. Put a little bit more here. Now, if your paint is too thick, it's going to just glop on and it's not really going to move. So you really need it to be, the consistency of your paint is really the hardest thing to master. And, you know, I still have trouble with that sometimes. So just take your time with it. And if it's too thick, then just add a little bit of water. Add a little bit of water and it'll move for you. So I'm going to take a little bit more and I'm going to put some down in here. Kind of like where that top petal is right here. It's shadowing. It's creating a shadow on this bottom petal. So while that's wet, you know, I'm just working that out. Okay, I'm going to let that sit and dry. And now I'm going to come over. I think I'm going to come over to this one here. And now I'm going to start really getting in some of my darker values. So I'm going to wet this petal, kind of going around, doing the same thing. I'm wetting this petal, but this time I'm going to be using some darker, more saturated color. And I will start with this bright red here. Get a good amount on my brush. And I'm going to start down towards the center or towards this leaf here where I would have a shadow. I'm going to grab a little bit of this more magenta color like I did here, and I'm going to drop some of that in as well. Just where I would have some nice darks on those petals. And just take your time with this. There's no rush. Now see here, that is just sitting here where this is just kind of feathered out. That's because I didn't wet over here. You see the difference there? Wet on dry over here. So I'm going to just use my damp brush and blend that out. And just kind of pull some of this color out. Now you can mix your colors here. Don't be afraid, you know, to mix your oranges, you know, your reds. Let them blend all right on your paper. Let them play together on the paper. You can mix, you know, make your oranges up. Drop in some of that color and let them blend right on the paper together. Okay, now if I wanted to create the vein lines, there's a couple of ways I could do that. I could do that with, I got a little bit on the outside here. I could do that with it being wet. I could then take a hard edge, like an old credit card or a palette knife or something like that, like a hard edge here. And while this is damp, I could then go over where I wanted my lines to be with this hard edge. Now, remind you, this will create dents in your paper. You will not be able to lift this out or remove them. Once you put them in, I could do that. And then what happens is while this paint is still wet, the creases in your paper will then create like little, lift that out a little bit. The creases in your paper will create dents, so that paint will kind of flow back down into those dents. Now, if you want those, that will create like darker veins. You can always wait and paint them in after, or you could do like let your paper dry a bit like we did here. This one's still damp, but it's kind of dry. It's kind of drying. You could then take and remove the paint by scraping. So drier paper, it removes. Wetter paper, the paint then absorbs down into those gaps and creates darker veins. So drier paper, it lifts the paint out and creates lighter veins. And then wet paper, it creates darker by doing that. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of create my own with some paint later on. So we got this one a little bit darker. Now we'll move over. Let's move over to this guy. So same thing, I'm going to wet him. And I always kind of go in the direction of my petals. So like I'm not going to go up and down here. I'll go out with my water and my paint in the direction of my petals. So I'm just wetting this whole thing. And same thing, I'm going to just use a combination of my reds here and my orangey colors. And I'm just getting in some nice darks towards the center of my wet paper and pull it out. All right, I'm going to go in with a little bit of orangey. Make some more orangey color. And I'm going to drop a little bit of that in on my wet paper. Just for a variety of colors. A little bit more reds maybe. And I'm just using a little bit of water now. So as you can see, I kind of go back and forth to some of the reds and the oranges, and I let them blend right on my wet paper. Just to create a variety of color in each of my petals here, so it doesn't look so boring with just one color, one value. All right, I'll let that one dry a little bit. And the next step will be, then I'll go in and start really carving out my veins and shapes and starting to see them look like petals a little bit more. Okay, let me go up to this guy. So basically I'm going to do the same thing. He's got some green at the base and a little darker red at the top. So I'm going to wet him. And I'm going to drop a little bit more darker saturation. I think I'll use this kind of pinky maroony red. And I'm going to really get a nice amount of pigment here. And I'm just going to drop that in right here on my wet paper. Right at the tip of that petal. Now you could even, tilt your board to let gravity help it a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of water to help move that down a little. That might have been too much. Let me lift some of that out. And, you can tilt your paper. That's why I tape it to a gator board. That way I can handle it and not disturb my paper. So I'm lightly going over that green with just a little bit of water. And you can see how it kind of because I'm tilting my board, this is kind of running down a little bit. Get a little bit more of my red here, red. And I might drop a little bit of that over here. Just random. I'm just being very spotty random there with that red. And now I'll just take a little sap green, straight up sap green. And everything's kind of loose on my palette. It's not very pasty. Even though I do get dark saturation reds, colors, it's not thick where it's like a butter on my palette. It's still watery, but yet I have a nice saturation of color. So as long as you see it beading up and it's nice and saturated, you're good. You don't want it to be thick like butter, where it's not moving. So while this is wet, I'm just going to drop in a little bit of that sap green, but I'm not going to scrub these two colors together. I'm just dotting in some random green areas on this petal because I don't want to create mud. I don't want to create mud, and if I really blended these two together with my brush, I would get like a neutral muddy brown color. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to pull that down a little bit. So I'm going to just let that dry, just like that. Just establish where my little vein is. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on over to this guy now, this petal. We're going to make him darker than an orangey one that's behind him. So I'm just going to go back with this, which red is this again? My crimson red. And, I want to wet this first. So I'm just going over it with a little water. And remember, wet on wet, it is going to dilute your paint a little bit because you're putting wet paint on wet paper. It's going to dilute the paint a little bit. As if I were to add that to dry paper, it would be a little bit darker and more saturated. And just be careful of your little stamens there. So just water, and then I'm going to get a nice saturation of reds here. And I'm going to start down at the base here by my stamens and just be real careful. And go in on my wet paper here. And just kind of pull it out. Go in between. Kind of go along the edge of my pencil drawing. And then just a damp brush just to help pull that paint out so I don't make it one solid value color. I'm going to add a little orangey in there on my wet paper. Love to see a variety of colors in, you know, even if it's on a leaf or a petal or a bird's head. I love to see, you know, just the mixture of colors blending together. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to just take your wet paper and drop in, you know, your buddy colors. I call them my buddy colors because I know oranges and yellows and reds all blend beautifully together when mixed together. They're not going to create mud. So I'm just going to kind of take all three of my reds here and a little bit of my orangey mixture and just drop them in on your petals. It makes for a more interesting painting. So you can kind of see where these two are starting to separate now because I'm going darker here with this petal and then leaving the one behind it a little bit lighter. I'm going to switch brushes here. I'll grab some red, and now I'm going to really go in between my stamens here and really get some nice dark saturated reds and color in here to start to really get in that darker value. So I'm just taking my number 4 brush and I'm just going in and carefully painting on dry paper here around my little stamens. I know I just kind of went over this. So this is still a little bit damp, but that's okay. Just fade that out. Pick up some more paint. Don't be afraid to get nice and dark red in here. It creates such a pretty contrast next to the lighter values. Next to those light yellows, a really nice dark. Creates some really pretty. That's where, you know, it makes them stand out, makes them pop. And it's basically kind of like, you could even, you know, as you get more experience, it's called negative painting, where you're painting around, you're painting in the negative space of the subject. So here the negative space or the positive are the stamens, and the negative space is around the stamens. So I'm basically painting around them right now, and it's helped bringing them out. It's making them pop. So just take, you know, take your time with this. And you see where I'm holding my brush like a pen. And that's when you know I'm really getting into detailed work or fine small areas. And I kind of am goobly-gop down here. There's really no any kind of separation, so I'm just kind of even creating my own. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Please know that. Nothing in nature is perfect. And you want it to look like a painting. You don't want it to look like a photograph. Because if that was the case, you could just take a picture. I never want my paintings to look like a photograph. It's not my style. Okay, so as I'm coming out onto this petal, you know, I don't want it to be this dark, crazy dark, but yet I don't want it to dry with that hard edge right there either. So what I'm going to have to do then is rinse my brush as I'm coming up here and just use a damp brush to then pull this color and just have it blend right out. And if you get a little bit on your stamens, sorry, just blot it out. See, I waited too long. I'm starting to create a hard edge there. Just get a little bit more color and then more water. So I'm blending it out. If you have too much of an area where it's start and stop with this dark and light, just wet that area like I just did with the damp brush and just add a little bit more color, you know, out towards your petal, just so it's just eventually kind of just blends. All right, let's get nice and dark in here. Okay. This is probably the hardest part, is just getting in between all those little spaces. So I don't want these hard edges here. So I take my damp brush, clean damp brush, and just really go over that with water. Add a little bit more color here. On my wet paper. And then just water. Blend it all out. I think I'm going to add a little bit more red up in here. Now I wet that. I pulled water all the way up to the end there. Just get a little bit more color up there. And my poinsettia leaf. Okay, same thing down here. Now here, we have like some nice dark colors in here. Dark greens and reds. So for this, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my crimson red here. Here's what I'm going to do, is get a little bit of crimson red or whatever red you're using. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit and put it over here, my palette. Now I want to darken that a bit. I want it to be like a darker, rich red. So any way to always kind of tone down or darken a color is use its complement. I mean, there are other ways, but this is because I'm limited here with what I could, my colors. I'm going to use, since this is more of a greeny, bluey kind of color, I could do two things. I could mix a little bit of my blue with that and make like a dark, dark purpley color. Or I think what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of my sap green and mix it in with my red. Now I got a really browny green color. Don't want that. I'm going to take a little bit more of my red, add back some red to it until I get a nice dark, kind of rich, dark red color. And I just keep mixing in red until I'm satisfied with the color. So that's like a nice dark, nice dark rich red that I can use now down here deep in that shadowy area. So that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to do it on dry paper, and I'm going to come in here with that dark kind of browny red color, and not very far out. I don't want to go very far out, but I'm just bringing it out a little bit, and then I'm going. So I'm just adding dark, rich red brown. A little straight red to it. Okay, damp brush. I'm just going to, since I'm working on dry paper here, got to be kind of quick, pull that, just kind of pull it out. I'm dropping a little bit more in, along the edge here. And then damp brush. And I just literally use water to where I really can't see how far I poured it out, or you know, where it starts and stops. I'm dropping a little bit more on my dark browny red. And here I'm also going to just take a little bit of sap green and just nice dark sap green, and I'm literally dotting it in. I'm dotting it in. I don't want to blend it, scrub it together to make a brown color. I just want to leave it nice and dark green. Start to bring it out a little bit. Now my petal, it's pretty dry here, so I'm just going to take a little bit of water and really start pulling that green out. I'll put a bit more of my red. I really want to be nice and dark in there. Now, can you remember, this, you know, would help to kind of let this all dry right in there. If you really are having a hard time getting it nice and dark, and you're just kind of pushing that paint around because it's wet, let it dry and go back over it with on dry paper, which I might do once this is dried up a little bit. Taking my green. So I'm just pulling that green out on my damp paper here. Ooh, got a little bit on my brush. It's okay. Just going to pull it out in the direction of my petal all the way. Taking more of my sap green. And I'm just being kind of intentional now with my strokes. I'm going to take some of my bright red here. Really nice saturated red. And I'm going to come over here. Everything's very wet right now, so it should just kind of feather right out. And just put some red right here on the edge. And I'm just kind of very lightly adding some of that red into that leaf. And I'm going to take just a damp brush and using water, just carefully kind of pushing that all in to that green. Everything's very wet at this point. So just let everything kind of, you know, do its thing. Just dotting it in. I'm going to forget this side. I'm just going to add some reds over here. Wet paper. And I'm just going to let that lift a little bit of this out. So I just take a damp, clean brush and I just press down, lift a little bit out. Got a little too red. So I'm just lifting a little bit of that out just to create some variety of value in that area of that petal. So I have some greens in there and my reds. So at this point, I'm going to let that dry. And then later, if I wanted to create more of that the stem appearance, I can go in with the darker and just kind of, even though this leaf is really covering it more than in the reference photo, I could, you know, then create like a line coming through here, which I'll do once that dries a bit more. Okay, let me work on this guy a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to wet him first. And then just drop in a little bit of my red. So at this point, I'm just using a mixture of whatever reds. I'm not worried about specific ones. So I'm just kind of focused here towards the edges and bringing it kind of horizontally. Damp brush. I don't think I got this wet enough. So I'm just adding more water. And then just my reds. And I'm just kind of pulling them horizontally across this leaf. And you see where I'm holding my brush this time? Less control that way. The tighter you are with your paintings, if you paint like this all the time, you're going to get very, very tight. You want to, sometimes you need to hold back on your brush to get some less controlled, looser brush strokes. So you can see I just kind of went in this way, went in that way on damp paper. Okay, I think at this point I'm going to let this completely dry, and then I'll come back and start really, really defining some of those petals. So I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, ladies, so it is later in the day. My painting is dry, so sorry for the shadow here. It's in the evening now, but I just want to finish up here with our poinsettia. So basically, I'm going to be really getting in, making my darker darks in certain little spots here and there. I'm going to add some kind of a little bit of greens in here in the base of my stamen and darken up some of my petals here, because right now these are pretty much a light value. They don't really, besides the green, you don't really see a difference here in the value. I want to darken this one up a bit, and definitely these. So let's see how much we can get done here. And if not, I will finish this in the morning. That's why, you know, with watercolors, it does take a while. It takes many layers to get the depth of color that you need and to allow things to dry. So I knew this wouldn't be finished in one sitting. So anyway, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to mix up some really dark darks, and I'm going to um, so where I had that red and green mixture, I made some kind of a reddish brown. I'm going to make a violet color. So I'm just going to use my red, this red here, my crimson red, and I'm going to bring it over here and put a little bit down. And I'm going to just add a little bit of my ultramarine blue. Mix it up, and a little bit more of my red, until I get a nice, and not adding any more water, so you can see, because I want to get it to be a nice dark color. So I don't want to add any water to lighten it up. So I'm really going to get a lot of that red in there. Make it a warmer. Nice, rich, Merlot type of color. That's a nice dark. And you see, when I push my paint like that, you see how it's not really puddling or moving? I'm going to add just a tiny, tiny bit of water, because I don't want it to be stiff like that, where when you move it, I want to see a little bit of movement into that mixture. So I add a little bit of water. And basically, I'm going to do the same thing I did with those the reddish brown color that I added here. I'm also going to add some really, really tiny amounts of darks, really, really darks right into this area, as well as maybe a little bit along the edge here of some of these petals where they're being shadowed underneath. So I'm going to just, on dry paper, I'm going to take that dark, dark, creamy, you know, winey, purpley mixture. And I am just going to kind of put it down there in that corner. I'm going to rinse my brush and blot it. And you guessed it, just take that edge and soften out, pull it down a little bit. Pull it down. Maybe a little bit more. Get those nice dark values. Blend it out. Still using my number 4 brush. I'm going to come down here along the edge of this petal to the left. Go to the right of it, just a little bit of a darker edge there. And then a damp brush, a little water drop. Damp brush, just pull it out. A bit more. And that's really going to help this petal stand out and look like it's, you know, sitting on top of this other one. Okay. See if I have that blended out. There's no like hard edge, start and stop. So now I'm going to add a little bit of a bluey green mixture here. So I'm going to take a little bit of my sap green, a little pile of that. And I think I'm going to add a little bit of my indigo here, which is kind of like a more of a, I'm going to say greeny blue, but I could be wrong. But it's a nice, rich, dark blue, and I'm going to get a nice, dark, bluey green with this color. If you don't have indigo, that's fine. You can mix some ultramarine blue with it. So it's like a bluey greenish color. But I'm also now going to just tap in to this damp area of my flower here. And I'm going to start kind of pulling it out, like where this veiny line is. But I'm going to stop. I'm not going to like, you know, keep going. I'm going to stop, rinse my brush, and just take a nice soft damp brush and pull that out. I'm kind of going right over top of that with a damp brush. I'm just pulling it all the way to the edge of my paper, kind of curving it a little bit, opposite of this. I'm going opposite for some reason, but it's okay. Just kind of smoothing all this out and going to just soften all that up and create a nice little vein mark. Dropping a little bit more of that bluey green color in there over my damp paper now, and just kind of coming down and continuing with that. Now, while that color's there, and some of my paper is a little bit damp right there, what I can do is then, if I wanted to, I could then start going in, and I'm holding my brush right here, and I'm just using the very tip, and I'm just pulling the paint that's already there just to create. I'm pressing so ever light. I mean, I'm barely pressing down. I'm barely pressing down because I just want very, very light little vein marks. And then of course I'm going to rinse and blot and just use what's here and just kind of soften them out a bit. So basically I pulled some paint from that middle edge and brought it out and made some those veiny marks. Can also use a little bit of that violet color. So just make it your own. I go over it maybe with a little bit of that violet. Add a little of that violet to the green. This is optional. You don't have to do, you know, the exact colors that I'm doing. Don't worry about that. Just want you to see the techniques that I do. But you make it your own. Now I'm going to take a little bit of that bluey green and kind of go this way. A little bit of my lines here. Don't worry, they don't have to be perfect. And then a damp brush. And I just soften all these out. Now, not crazy about them. So you know what I'm going to do? I usually don't put a lot of lines or veins in my leaves, but I wanted to show you how you could do it. I'm not crazy about it, so I'm going to take a little bit of red. Very, very light wash here. So you can see a light wash. I'm going to kind of go over this whole thing just to tone down those lines a bit. Just tone it down. Now I just gave it a very, very light wash. So the only thing it did was just darken it a bit. Didn't take away my green. I didn't press real hard or anything like that. It just kind of toned it down. Take a little bit more of my violet in here. Get it a little bit more darker. This is the fun part where you really get to like tweak your painting, add those details and such. You put some little dots and marks out here because got all this little stuff going on. A little bit of marks in there to give a little interest in your leaves and your petals. Kind of helps a little bit. All right, so let me move on here. All right, I'm gonna scooch over to this petal here. I'm gonna switch to my larger brush. I'm gonna give it a little bit of a one over on dry paper with my red. So I'll start at the base and just add water. So I took a brush load of paint and now I'm just using water. I just want to darken this up a bit. Got a little bit more. Because remember, your watercolor is always dry. Around, you know, at least 30% or so drier, or lighter, I'm sorry, lighter than when you first put them down. Okay, so while that's damp, what I'm going to do is pick up this violet color, a little bit more red to that. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I see where my pencil line still is, where my, the center of that leaf would be. So I'm just going to kind of go from there on my damp paper, and I'm going to add a little bit of that violet as to create a little bit of the indent of that petal. Just like that, I barely touched it. A little bit of that violet color. And it just, because my paper was wet from my paint, it just kind of feathered out a little bit. And now I'm just going to hit it with a damp brush and just kind of tap on it with a damp brush to kind of help it a little bit more. Try not to make like tiger stripes. I'm just blending things out here a little bit. And if you want to, you know, add a little bit more, you can. If you want to wait for things to dry and then go back in and re-wet it, re-wet that area, and then, you know, add a little bit more color in. You can do that. So I'm just barely touching my paper here. A little bit of that violet mixture. And then I go back in, clean damp brush. And just kind of blend things out. I'm going to take a little bit of my red, maybe drop a little bit of darker red in there. So at this point, you just have to kind of, you know, it's more intuitive for me at this point. You know, I just put some colors in there where I feel like it might need a little bit darker values. And then I just let them go. So I'm just going to let that dry now. But it kind of gives it a little bit of movement and a little bit of texture in there on those on that leaf. Okay, here, same thing. I'm going to wet this first. And then I'm going to drop in a little bit of my reds closer to the center here where it would be a little darker. Pull it out. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of this mixture here. I'm going to drop a little bit of that in here at the base while it's still damp, just to give it some dark. And you can see here, this dark line coming down. So while this whole petal is wet, I'm going to use this violet mixture over top of the red I just put in, and I'm just very lightly going to pull that down, and then just kind of same thing, kind of just very lightly put in some veins here. I'm going over it with a damp brush now. Just kind of blend it out, soften it out. And just gives a little texture. I might even want a little bit, have these be a little bit more, a little bit red, a little bit more red. So just kind of go over that whole thing real lightly though. I'm barely pressing down on the paper. Blend that out. Barely pressing down. And please don't worry about it looking exactly perfect. No, it doesn't have to look exactly perfect. Okay, I'm going to work on this one a little bit. Let me switch brushes back to my number 4. I'm going to go in, I'm going to wet this. And then I'm going to drop in a little bit of my violet. Might make a little bit, add a little bit more red to it, so it's not quite as purpley. So add a little more red to that. Choosing different reds here. Out of my 3. And then what I'm going to do is kind of right at this base here. I'm just going to kind of go in there and hold my brush a little bit further back so I'm not quite as controlled. And I'm just going to jiggity jaggedy go over that damp paper. Again, barely pressing down. It's very jiggity jaggedy. Apparently that is not that wet. I can tell right away if I need more water because the paint just sits there and doesn't feather out. Okay. Just a little bit. A little bit of a damp brush. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of that bluey green mixture that I have right there. And I'm gonna just kind of really softly, same thing, I'm just going horizontally across my leaf here. A little bit of that very, very watery mixture. And I'm just dropping it in. And do you see how I left like little white marks? Like there's just little textury marks to that. Okay, I'm going to let that one dry a bit. I still want to define it a little bit more, but I'm going to let it dry. I'm going to move on over to this leaf, or that petal. And I'm going to wet this one. First, going in. And I'm going to add a little bit of that winey mixture here. I'm going to kind of go in the center like I'm creating my little bit of a, you know, that vein. I'm just going to go in and I'm just dropping in on that damp paper, just some of that darker winey color here, just to get some texture and some darker marks. So I'm just, look where I'm holding my brush. Remember, further you hold it back, the less control and the less pressure you're going to put down. So I'm just kind of, you know, being very loose and not tight and, you know, being very intentional. I'm not. I'm just taking some of that, so just mixing up my colors here, using a variety of colors just to kind of go in and create marks on my leaves, just to kind of give them some texture and some dimension and not take it too seriously. You don't want to do that. I get drops of water on the ferrule part of my brush. So I'm just going to kind of go in and make little marks here and there just to kind of add some texture to my leaves. Okay, I am going to stop right here. It's getting dark and a lot of shadows. So I will continue this tomorrow, ladies, and have a good rest of the night. Okay, so I am back now, and these are all dry. Really, we don't have a ton more to do, just to kind of really darken up some of these petals like this one. I'm going to work on adding in some of my greens here at the base of these little stamens and defining these petals a little bit more, darkening them up. So kind of ended here with darkening up this petal. I'm going to add a little bit more greens in here and darken up a little bit here at the edge of my reds. So I'm just going to start with this kind of winey color that I had made with my reds and my ultramarine, and I also add a little indigo in there just to kind of make like a nice darky winey color. So play around with your blues and your reds to get a nice mixture in there, what you like. So a nice dark, saturated color is really what you want for these little darker shadows here and there, where we have those darker shadows. So I'm going to take this little winey mixture that I just made now with my number 4, and I'm going to go in right here where it's really, let me pull that down, where it's a little bit darker in here. Also in here, I'm going to add a little bit, and I'm going to just darken just a tiny bit more here underneath this petal. So I'm starting on dry paper so I can, keep my colors nice and dark. And I'm going to just kind of go in right above this petal here and just define this dark a little bit more. Bring it up a little bit. And I think I'm going to add a little bit in here as well. I just want those stamen bases to really start to pop. So I'm just going to add, a little bit of darks. I'm not bringing it all the way up, but I'm just adding a little bit kind of right where they meet. And before that dries, I want to rinse my brush, blot it, and then I'm going to just soften the very top edges of these. And just, I pull up that water, blend that edge out as far as I need to. Rinse your brushes frequently, because what happens is, too much water there, I create a little puddle. What happens is, as you're softening the edges, you'll be picking up paint. So you don't want to just keep redepositing more paint there. So rinse your brush periodically and, keep that edge clean. So I'm going to put a little bit in here. I'm just really trying to, too much water. I can tell when I pick up either my paint has too much water in it or my brush does, and I drop puddles down. So as you can see, I'm just kind of reinforcing my darker darks. At the base there a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more in there, kind of wipe that out a little too much. A little bit more dark. And you always, always want that nice contrast where you have your darkest darks against your lightest lights. So these are my lightest areas on my painting. And these are my darkest areas, so they're really going to help each other stand out. I'm going to just do a tiny bit more in here. Not much more dark in here. Just a tiny bit more. Pull that out. Rinsing and blotting. Pull that over here. And just kind of blend it out with a damp brush if you have to. Okay, I'm going to come here to this leaf. Take that same winding mixture. I might add a little bit more red to that. So a nice dark red. And I'm going to kind of do my dark red right against the base of these stamens right here. Just kind of putting a little bit right here towards the edge of this petal, leaf, whatever it is. So I just did it kind of here and here. Rinsing and blotting again. And then going kind of horizontally, just pulling that out a little bit more. Don't want to wait too long because it will dry and I won't really be able to blend it out as much. So I'm going to just take a straight up some of that red, brighter red. And I'm just kind of reinforcing. See how I kind of just make lines? And then I'll go in and soften them out a little bit. Still leaving a little bit of, you know, still leaving a little bit of lighter space in between. So I'm not making it a solid, you know, a solid color in there. You can see all the different values in there and colors that I've used. So I'm trying not to make it just a plain, flat, solid color. Okay. Now at this point, I'm going to just add a little bit more green. Just kind of towards the center. Maybe a little bit of yellow for a little bit of variety of color in my greens. And then I'm going to let that dry. And then I will go in and create a little bit of a vein, just slightly though. Okay, I'm going to move on over. I'm going to come here now. And I'm going to just darken a little bit here towards where my the middle vein is. I'm going to just take a little bit of my red here on dry paper, and I'm going to just kind of go on the top edge of that vein, and I'm just going to kind of use the tip and the belly of my brush, press down, and I just pull up a little bit, and then I'm just going to kind of use that color to bring it out a little bit further. Come up here a little bit, just to darken up that petal. And then I will kind of, you know, after I've rinsed my brush a little bit, blotted it really good, I'm just going to use the belly to kind of blend some of that out. Now I'm going to take and use what's there paint wise. I mean, a little bit more, and kind of just add a little bit more color to the bottom edge of that petal, but not as much as I did going this way. So I just wanted to kind of darken up that petal a little bit more. And then I'm going to kind of go in here. I think I'm going to make, I'm going to strengthen up just a little bit of that color here, but not much. So I'm going to take a little bit of my red, because I definitely want this one to stand out and this one to fade back. I'm going to take a little bit of my red here, a little bit of yellow, and make a light orangey kind of color. Add a little water to it, just even lighten it up a little bit more. And I'm just going to kind of go in and just kind of hit this top edge and pull it down. Just to add a little bit more to that back petal. Okay, now over here, I want this guy to sit behind this one and this one. So I'm going to take my red right now, and I'm going to kind of work on this petal. And what I'm going to do right now is, in order to force that one to go behind, I'm going to go right up along the edge here of this petal, and I'm going to, on dry paper, and I'm going to kind of go in the direction of the way the veins are. So I'm going to take my paint and just kind of pull it down so this guy sits behind. Right now he looks like he's equal or even sitting on top. So I'm going to just kind of go right along the edge of that petal and really darken up this one here. And I'm using the tip and the belly. And remember, you got to work quickly here because I'm working on dry paper. I don't want things to dry like that. So right away I go back in with my damp brush and just really rinse and blot, and then go back and over those lines, those marks, and just pull it down towards the center. So I'm really just kind of strengthening up this whole petal and giving it a little bit of detail by creating these lines where maybe the veins would be. And they all don't have to look, you know, the same. They don't have to be the same thickness or anything like that. As you can see, I make some fatter, and then I just constantly am going back, rinsing my brush, and just going over it. Now with this side, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to go in this direction, just adding some more color to strengthen this petal. And I'm pretty much using the same red with varying degrees of, like, sometimes I grab a little bit thicker pigment here, and sometimes I go in where it's a little bit watered down a little bit. So I get different values here in this petal because of the amount of water that's in my paint and in my brush. I don't expect you guys to, you know, really, I don't even want yours to look like mine. I want to see your version of what you can do. If this, please let me know if you feel like this one was a little bit more difficult and we need to do something easier. Definitely we can do that. I know this took many layers to get, you know, the darkness and the way it stands out. It does take some time to get it, you know, to where it starts to feel comfortable to you, and that takes time. So don't feel like you have to know it all. with, you know, 2 paintings under your belt. It takes many, many, many. So just keep practicing, and eventually it just will start to come a little bit more natural to you. So what I did here was I took a little bit of my yellow and I kind of added a little bit more yellow to that little orangey mixture that I had here. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that to my damp paper here. Just to give a little variety of color in this petal. Okay, now I'm going to go over here and darken up this one. Just still using my red. But this time I'm going to kind of come this direction. This one doesn't really have like any, I guess the veins will kind of be coming this way. I'm going to just kind of go along this edge of this behind petal and just, I'm going to darken up right along the edge there with just some more solid red. On dry paper, I'm going to come down. I'm just going to kind of add some color in. Kind of drop of water here. I'm going to just take my damp brush now, clean damp brush, and just kind of pull that color down. And this guy is still sticking out to me like he's sitting on top. And it could be because I darkened these, which would, sometimes it makes it look like the lighter one's on top. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just define this one a little bit more and not worry about it. And if he's sitting on top a little bit, oh well. So I'm going to take a little bit of my red and I'm just going to add a little bit of red up top here. Just give him a little texture. And then I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm just going to pull that down. Remember, we're painting a painting and not a photograph, so doesn't have to be completely correct ever. So kind of does look like he's sticking. I think you know what I think what's bothering me? This green part right here. So what I'm gonna do is, it looks like a peony bud. So I'm gonna take a little bit of my red and I'm gonna cut him off right there and make it part of these other two. So I'm going to just paint right over that with a little bit of darker red. And hopefully that'll help push him behind a little bit. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of my dark kind of winey color. And I'm going to then, since my petals don't meet here like they do in this photo, I don't need to add that darker shadow. But if they were together, I would add a little bit of darker right in between there to kind of create that little shadow. So since I connected these two now, I'm going to do that with this one. I'm going to darken up along the edge of this here. Darken it up a little bit, just like that. And then I'm going to do the same on this side a little bit. Okay. I'm going to try and do is scrape out some of that cut green with and create some kind of veiny marks, but I'll do that last. So right now I'm pretty happy with all my petals here. This guy might need a little bit more definition. So I'm going to take that winey color and just darken ever so slightly my vein here and right at the base. A little bit of deeper shadowy color just at the base, just like kind of like that. Rinse and blot and come in and just soften that out a bit. It's pretty light down here. I'll make it a little bit more of an orangey, a little bit more of a reddy orange. I think I'm going to just kind of apply that. So this is where like the icing of the cake comes in. You get to tweak your painting, and because my paper is dry here, I'm getting more of a dry brush effect because my paint here is not very wet. My brush doesn't have a ton of water in it, so I'm getting more of a dry brush effect, which dry brushing is when you can hear it. It's when your paper is dry, you don't have a lot of water in your paint, your brush is kind of dry, and it scrapes over the texture of your paper, which works really, really well for when you're doing like water, and you get that little glistening marks in your water. So dry brushing is really good for that. So now I'm just taking a little bit of water and maybe softening some of these dry brush marks, but that looks better. It gives it a little bit of texture. So I'm going to stop with these petals right now, and now I'm going to work on adding a little bit of green to the base of my stamen here. So I'm just going to take some straight up sap green, and I'm just going to kind of go on dry paper here. I'm just going to add a little bit to the stems and a little bit just right at the base, like the bulb of a flower. I'll do a couple, rinse and blot, and blend out that little bit of that top edge. So it just gives them a hint of green in there. I'll do one here, which he doesn't really have a stem, but that's okay. Kind of just creating the illusion of some stamens. A little dark there. It's okay. A little bit in here, a little bit in here. Soften it up, blend it out. And then let's see, I'll do a little bit here, a little bit here. So as you can see, I'm not being too particular. A little bit in this one. And a little green over there. And then I just blend them out. Wow. Okay. I'm going to take a little tiny bit of my indigo. Oh, that's really dark. Too much. Little tiny bit. Add it to my sap green. Just to dull that green down, make it a little bit more bluey green. Okay. And I'm going to create a little bit of a vein there, but really light. I'm going to hold my brush back a little further. I don't want it to be too dark. I get a lot of bead up of water here. This is called the ferrule, this part of your brush. And I always get a bead of water on this particular brush, and then it drops onto my painting when I don't want it. So, all right, I'm going to start here in the center, and I'm just going to kind of come out like that. Rinse, rinse, rinse. Right away. Damp brush. Soften that with some water and just kind of fade it out. I just want to suggest it's a vein. Okay, so let me show you guys the card here. So the edge of a card. And I'm going to try and make some lighter veins here. This one's dry. If it was wet, it would then deposit the color into those little scrapes that I'm going to be making. But because this is dry, I'm going to see if I can scrape out some color by using the edge of a card. And I'm just going to kind of go like this. I'm pressing down and just create some little bit of lines. Didn't remove too much. It's probably best to do it while it's damp. Not soaking wet, but damp. So let me wet this a little bit, see if maybe I can lift a little bit of that green out. Okay. Since the paint's not wet, I mean, it's not fresh paint. It did create some texture. It made them a little darker, just slightly, but it's okay because it gave it a little bit of texture, and I like that. So I think at this point, I'm going to call this one done. Otherwise, I could get crazy and overwork it too much. Yeah, I'm going to call this one done. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one and it wasn't too complicated for you. I didn't mean it to be. So let me know if you have any questions or anything. I'd be happy to answer. If you did want to put these little hoogies right here on top, you could do that. You know, just use some really, really heavy pigmented paint to go over the darker colors. So not a lot of water in your yellows or your lighter colors. You also could use, if you wanted, you could use some white gouache, which is basically watercolor that's opaque. You could use a tiny bit of white acrylic paint, and you can mix in some of your yellow to your white gouache or to your yellow or to your white acrylic paint. You could use a white gel pen if you wanted, and then go over it with a little yellow paint if you didn't want them to be white. So there's lots of options you can do. Let me paint a few on here with some really thick yellow. And I'm just going to paint a few here and there just to suggest, so you can barely see them, but that's okay because I don't want them to be in your face. So I'm just going to paint a few with that yellow. And the rule is really, you can't paint light over dark with watercolors, but you kind of can a little bit. If you're using heavy enough pigmented paint, you can kind of do it a little bit. And maybe one or two there, and that's it. And I know it's harder to see. So let me pull it up so you can see them a little bit. So then I'm going to call this one done. Let's take the tape off. Always looks better without the tape. Now, if I wanted to, if I really, really wanted to, I could paint this background like a nice dark green color. But because I've got so much going on here in this, in my flower, I'm not. I'm going to leave it white because it's nice and you know, it's nice color anyway. It's not a real pale color. If it was more of a pale poinsettia, I might consider it just to help it stand out a little bit. One tape. Okay. Always looks better when you take the tape off. And always, always don't pull up towards your painting with your tape, pull away. That way if your tape happens to catch your painting, chances of you tearing it will be slimmer. I have torn my paintings before. Not good. Get this off. Okay. Take it away from this gator board. So there we go. Really pretty. I'll make a pretty card, and I can still see my grid lines just a little bit, so I'll try and erase them a little bit more. You know, that's because I used a number 2 pencil, but if you can, eventually get some HB pencils. They're really, really nice, and that way you don't have dark pencil lines in your paintings, but I can always crop them out. So anyhow, thank you so much, ladies. I hope you enjoyed this one, and please let me know if you have any questions ever. Okay, and have a great rest of the day.